their agenda and its ideology has brought them to a place where they can't be effective as an imperial power. And that showed in the Biden administration. It pursued a feckless war against Russia, which was unbelievably stupid. The entire elite fawned and bought into it and embraced it, and look where we are. We've been defeated. And so now we've got to pull our act together, get out of that situation, and if possible, and this is the silver lining to a new relationship with Russia, turn it around.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is springtime, 91 AD. Domitian is in Rome, very far away. The Senate's unhappy with him, just as usual. We are sitting in our wine cups, speculating about the 21st century, and things have taken a surprisingly recognizable turn. It's wonderful. Heretofore, we've been talking about battles and attackums and air power and drones, striking at the infrastructure and evacuations. Now we get to talk about money, something the Roman Empire understood. We begin, however, with observations of how the negotiations are going between Moscow and Washington. Note that the war is in Ukraine, but Moscow and Washington are talking. I'm unaware that Ukraine is in the room, unless you count the Russian negotiator. His name is Kirill Dmitriev. He's Ukrainian. He is the master of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. He was educated in America. He was a consultant in America before he went back to Russia. Putin sent a central banker to negotiate with Steve Witkoff, who's also not warrior class, not a uniform-wearing, jump-out-of-an-airplane guy. He's a negotiator. They're looking for numbers. What do we know about this negotiation? In general, very little. They are bankers, but there was talk that Mr. Putin is interested in American investors in Russia's mineral wealth. So, not only this is not about attackums, it's not even about Ukraine. It's about Moscow and Washington cutting a deal for growth. Germanicus, I understand that Rome has to be bloody-minded when it comes to war fighting. I understand that. However, what we're witnessing now is highly entertaining and goes to the strength of the American Empire, which is built upon the British Empire, which is built upon us, the Roman Empire. We never had financial wizardry the way they do in the 21st century. I'd like to take credit for it, but there it is. They're looking for a deal in all instances. Remind me, now that we look very carefully at this, what do you think Mr. Putin is up to, and what do you think Mr. Trump is up to? What is the outcome for Ukraine? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. What we're seeing is the subterranean connection, for a moment unearthed, because it's impossible to conceal. You have an envoy plenipotentiary here to essentially, well, not here, but the meeting in Moscow will essentially be to start.
In Washington.
Oh, okay. But it's all about a realignment of the U.S. in a way that empires have conducted in the past. It's not the easy comparison, for example, to Nixon going to China. It's a bit more complicated than that. We've been at war with Russia, and if you don't believe we've been at war with Russia for the last 3 years, or better yet, the last 9 or 10 years, all you have to do is read that recent New York Times article that completely exhumes down to the smallest operational detail the way in which the U.S. has literally run the war, not just financed it, supplied the weapons, but actually masterminded, and then down to the tactical level, targeting and guidance of weapons. It is an American war against Russia, and it is remarkable, and that speaks really to Mr. Putin as a leader. It's remarkable that Russia has showed so much restraint, and yet it's also shown tremendous patience um, that it could show in the sense that it became clear relatively quickly, and we talked about it at the time, that the war was going to go Russia's way eventually. And so it has. And at this point, there are no options left for the United States except those that Mr. Trump is taking. And they're prudent steps. One is for the U.S. to align itself in an economic and potentially security relationship with Russia and to essentially give the U.S. some strategic space. And what do we mean by strategic space? Well, the U.S. has space to maneuver if it doesn't have to fight Russia anymore. If it ends a loser war and then embarks on a fruitful relationship with Russia, that turns a lot of things around. It's also strategic space in the sense that it allows us more opportunity to focus on what we need to at home. And that is a parlous situation given, the profligate, flagrant spending of the last several decades. And so things need to be trimmed and cut, not just departments in the U.S. civilian workforce, but also in the military. There has to be a scaling back. And finally, the strategic space that's opened up is one in which the U.S. can approach China from a different vantage. There's opportunity for the U.S. potentially to engage in the same approach with China, something that is possible because China, like Russia, like the US, is not in a situation where an arms race or fighting a proxy war, as the US has done against Russia, is to anyone's advantage. China is in economic difficulties itself, and opinions differ as to how serious it is. But looking across a range of indicators that anyone can follow, China has or is facing many of the same brick walls that the U.S. is. And so having strategic space to reorient is great. It's not just a breather, but it pulls you back from a course which was really potentially devastating for the U.S. And this is all a good thing.
I lean into the question of what kind of deal that would interest both Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. The mineral wealth I understand. However, Russia has now committed its economy these last 2 years to what is called military Keynesianism, everything for the front. They're running their defense industry 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, demanding labor everywhere and higher wages, and inflation, I believe, is in north of 20%. I lose count sometimes. It keeps climbing. So what we've got here is an economy that's full
Over here. Yeah.
full tilt for war.
Hmm.
We need a lot of help coming out of it. A lot of help.
Yes. And as you recall, at the end of World War One, the Keynesian-driven war economies of Britain and the United States suffered serious recessions, post-war recessions. The U.S. did not after World War II because the Soviets came barreling along, and the U.S. was able to go right back into that Keynesian space, and also it got engaged in resurrecting Europe under the Marshall Plan, and that all led to a ferocious spurt of growth for the U.S. But it's important to remember that the U.S. engaged in the same kind of economic Keynesianism in World War II that Russia is engaged in now, and the U.S. economy grew hugely during the war years. And one of the best ways to transition and try and avoid a post-war recession is to open up new areas of economic development. And the U.S. can offer that because the U.S. has all of the oil technology, drilling technology, and more, and can help Russia exploit its resources, which would allow for a transition back into, um, uh, you know, something like a peacetime economy. And I think Russia's aware of that completely. And this is something China is going to have to deal with too, because China has been pursuing not a war economy, but it's been developing all of the weapons and capability it needs to take Taiwan. And I think that that would be something that they would welcome being able to move away from. It feels like we're at a kind of a potential watershed if these deals can be made. But of course, they can't be made unless the war can be ended, and it should be ended quickly. And if it's ended on Russian terms, my point, which I've made regarding the Vietnam War and other wars, is as soon as you get out, things will begin to get better. So if we end the war on Russia's terms, that's a one-time deal and it's over. And it was the policy of the previous administration. It was their debacle. They did it. To end it is simply to stop the bleeding. And then what if that also is accompanied by a kind of new relationship? Well, that is very positive, and it will cancel out this feeling of shame and anxiety that follows a defeat. And then I think that this is the moment to do that. And certainly the signs are all there. If you have American and Russian diplomats, neither of whom is a diplomat or a general, they are bankers. And when you get a deal like that, it signals that you're moving symbolically, not just in real terms, but it symbolically signals a shift away from conflict, confrontation, and war into a kind of a new thing. And in a way, this is something that Russia is used to historically. We've brought up several times the concordat between Napoleon and Alexander at Tilsit. And of course, there is the notorious compact between Stalin and Hitler through their intermediaries, Ribbentrop and Molotov. And that was done also primarily for economic reasons as much as strategic. Russia was able to provide Germany with endless raw materials that Germany desperately needed. So this is, in many ways, a kind of quid pro quo. And I bring up both the treaty at Tilsit and also the Ribbentrop-Molotov Accord, simply because these are agreements between former enemies, and it can happen, and it can be quite productive. In fact, the Tilsit Agreement lasted 5 years, and there's much more reason to believe that this one will be more productive. And it's all there. We'll see if there's enough clear thinking. The worst thing that could happen now would be for the Trump administration to get in the weeds and bring in Europe and Ukraine into any kind of deal. Listen, the potentially most positive thing about this New York Times quote unquote tell all, which by the way involved a lot of top secret confidences and information. The upside to all of this coming out is that it's so clear now that the US was directly fighting Russia that it should make a deal between Russia and the US, a bilateral agreement, not including Ukraine or Europe, make it totally legitimate. I mean, it's our war and it's their war. And I know that sounds awful, but it was awful. We were using Ukraine to do the bleeding for the United States. And at the same time, in spite of that, it was an American war against Russia. So we're the ones in a position who can end it now.
I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here, and we're looking at the headlines in the Wall Street Journal, which are loaded with possibilities of disaster. China wanted to negotiate with Trump. Now it's arming for another trade war. Or economic outlook shifts in days from solid growth to recession risk. Or, my favorite, Americans sitting on a cash pile as stocks reel. Germanicus, what we've got here is the whole world anxious about the tribute that the emperor is demanding. Now, why this is odd in the 21st century needs explanation. It's certainly not odd in the first century AD. Rome was the empire. We demanded our defeated enemies, adversaries, troublemakers, pay us tribute. We even made deals with our adversaries who weren't defeated. The American press apparently has forgotten what tribute means, or have they? Are they skipping it?
Tribute is more symbolic than it is real. But because it is real, it can provide the kind of authority that you want a symbol to convey. In other words, if you're getting a large pot of money, a treasure, that symbolically has great weight, literally also, in that it expresses a transfer that can be the underpinning for a relationship. So, for example, in our time, when our emperor Domitian has fought a war against Dacia, the peace requires Dacia to send the king's brother to Rome bearing a crown to acknowledge that Dacia is now a vassal of Rome. But in exchange, Rome will pay Dacia 6 million sesterces a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's just gold. And the whole point of the tribute is to cement the relationship. It isn't that Rome is giving something up. It's that the payment of the money, the gold, and the arrival of the Dacian brother of the king to pay homage and prostrate himself before the Roman emperor are the symbols that are required. And one of the things that a tribute from Ukraine and in a way from Russia does for the Trump administration and for America as a nation is that it's a solve for defeat. So we have been defeated by Russia on the battlefield, and this is uh, right there on paper for everyone to see. And so if Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin come to an agreement, and the result is that America has a deal for Russian raw materials, rare earth minerals, uranium, nitrates for fertilizer, all of that, including, of course, natural gas and oil, then that is a kind of a tribute that undergirds and symbolizes the new relationship between the US and Russia. Likewise, in a more traditional client vassal relationship, the deal that Trump basically proffered to Zelensky was much more of a direct acknowledgement that Ukraine is the US vassal.
What about the deal we're offering the EU, which is also part of the NATO?
Well, the vassalage there, and this is again, another one of the tragedies of the war, is that the stalwart alliance, the 14 nations of NATO during the height of the Cold War, where everyone was an equal and the US was merely primus inter pares, first among equals, has completely transformed in the last several years into NATO as a set of minor duchies that must come and pay homage personally with their leaders to the Oval Office. You saw that with Macron and Starmer coming to, to Mr. Trump, and essentially it was like an audience with the emperor. Again, bringing up the king of Dacia sending his brother with a crown to prostrate himself at the feet of Caesar Augustus.
The emperor demands that EU pays. Is EU going to pay?
Well, EU's already paid by buying our natural gas at 3 times what it would have cost to have bought Russian natural gas. And that was a terrible thing. And that was inflicted by the previous emperor, Mr. Biden, on Europe. And hopefully, in spite of the fact that they're all railing against Mr. Trump, the emperor, they are going to benefit. In fact, they've initiated, certainly Germany has, but also Britain and France have promised to. They've initiated a Keynesian militarization of their own. And so, if the outcome of this is that they are more autonomous, more their own man, as it were, that's to their good. That's to their benefit. So, in many ways, you could say that the emperor is doing them a great favor.
And the scare headlines in the Wall Street Journal, I can find them in all the newspapers.
Yeah.
That is what? Fear, panic, ignorance?
You mean the correction in the markets or the overreaction?
Yeah.
That is in large part due to the moment to moment neuralgic obsession with what's happening, what does it mean, and a desire for drama too, but also the fact that there's no extended thinking anywhere. Markets correct themselves when there are bigger distortions that can't be sustained.
And that was 90 at 24. There were always seven stocks that went up in 24. There was the S&P 493. There was
Yeah.
a Mag 7. The Mag 7 are now correcting, coming back down to mere 25 multiple.
Well, yeah, I'm just looking back at say the terrible situation in 2008 and 9 where things looked like they were going to
Oh,
collapse and they didn't, and they all came back within a few years.
we're not
Frankly,
even close
that
to.
happened in the 30s as well.
There's nothing like that today. Nothing like.
No, no, this is totally within normal bounds, and the correction is
It's,
important.
how is it that the American empire's people
Hmm.
do not understand that it's the American empire to demand and it's our clients to pay? How is it that the American people are not educated about that?
Well, I don't think it's the American people. I think it's the elite that had a couple decades ago set themselves on the path that ended up in the Church of Woke, where they were seeking to entrench their power through a new national canon in which all the people who built America were evil, and therefore the entire nature of society had to be changed. So their agenda and its ideology has brought them to a place where they can't be effective as an imperial power. And that showed in the Biden administration. It pursued a feckless war against Russia, which was unbelievably stupid. And, the entire elite fawned and bought into it and embraced it. And look where we are. We've been defeated. And so now we've got to pull our act together, get out of that situation, and if possible, and this is the silver lining to a new relationship with Russia, turn it around. So we're not in the position that we were in just a few months ago, where things were literally falling apart for us in the world.
And we look at Plato, who was a consultant to Syracuse, the most powerful state of his era. This is after the Peloponnesian War, 50 years, 60 years later. And Athens is now frail. Sparta's burned out. Corinth is okay. It's the mother city of Syracuse, but Syracuse was all powerful. The big fleet, it was the American empire of the time. It was the Roman Empire of the time. We live several centuries later, so we've been educated to venerate Syracuse and the dictator Dionysius and the challenge to Dionysius. Now, Plato advised Dionysius. You've all heard of Plato's Republic. It's a dictatorship. And Dionysius is the man imagined. There's another man involved in this, his son Dion. But what's important here is to emphasize that Syracuse was all powerful. And it wasn't asking the people's okay. The people were told what was best for them. They had an army of, well, the estimates are up to 100,000. They had a fleet of 300. Nothing came close to challenging Syracuse. Maybe Carthage in terms of merchant trading.
Yeah.
There's talk that Carthage held it back. However, I come to you, Greek whisperer. The reputation that Plato enjoys here in the Roman Empire is totally undeserved. And the veneration he's going to enjoy for the next 2,000 years is equally unreserved. How did we come to this?
How do we come to what?
Admiring Plato so much.
Oh, well, we admire Plato because he was picked up by his those who followed him. His remote posterity, shall we say. And this happened in Rome. And one of the reasons it happened in Rome, thanks to Plotinus and Porphyry in the period of the second and third centuries, was that Neoplatonism was developed and became the bedrock of Christianity in terms of its philosophy and theology. And as a result, Plato was kind of hardwired into the West. And then in the Muslim world, with the rise of the caliphate, Plato became a great favorite of Islamic philosophy. His writing on the Republic and all the rest were incorporated in a heartfelt way into Islam's thinking. And of course, you had Plato as kind of an instrumental first wave of the Renaissance, because one of the last great philosophers in Byzantine Greece, Platon, Gemistos Platon, left after the fall of Constantinople and brought Plato with him to as a gift to Italy and all of its city-states. And so Plato, it's really amusing to see how Plato was insinuated into the mind and the sort of cultural weave, not just of the West, but also of the Orthodox world and Islam. And the fact is, the period we're talking about in the late 4th century BC, Plato was admired, but he was also mistreated. I mean, he got ensnared in Syracusan politics and was at the mercy of these tyrants who turned against him, and he was actually sold into slavery for a while. And it all to me indicates that Plato was onto something, because the problem of city-state politics was that it was so fractious and factionalized that it became chaotic often. And so there was inevitably a push for a kind of a kingship that would have better sinews and would be more stable and orderly. And we see this in what would happen just a couple generations after Plato, which would be the rise of the Hellenistic world, where you'd have really quite powerful kings who had really huge empires. And this worked out better. And ultimately, of course, Rome took over them all. And Rome has an emperor system, but it's remarkably effective for not being Republican. And so there are weaknesses in the whole city-state model that could no longer be sustained across the Greek world.
Plato would support decisions being made by the emperor right now. I'm guessing here. I'm not certain. Would he support the emperor demanding tribute from our allies and our adversaries, or making a deal with the major adversary? Would Plato support all that, or would he find it lacking in virtue?
Well, Plato's idea was to have virtuous rulers. And the big question is, how do you get virtuous rulers? And how do you avoid the problem of um, hereditary monarchs and despotic, what they used to call Oriental despots, like the great kings of Persia, Xerxes and Darius. And so his idea was not to go for the more chaotic and fractious democracy that was in any event run by the Greek equivalent of billionaires, but rather to find some kind of enlightened leadership. And in some ways, I guess you could argue that Rome came close to achieving that. Because if you think about it, the people are always essential to the stability and success of a polity. And this was true in city states, even when Plato was in Syracuse and had to deal with, Dionysius and Dion and their power struggles. Those power struggles were ultimately decided by the people who would rise to favor one or the other. And this is not very stable, but if you could find a way to harness that effectively so that you had the Roman Senate, the Roman people, and the emperor and the army in some kind of constitutional order that is stable, then that is the ideal. And it is to be realized in our near future in the period of the five good emperors. It's also, as its counterpoint, to be contrasted with many, many civil wars. So no one's come up with an ideal constitutional order, but I think the main thing that Plato was wrestling with was how to avoid the tremendous weaknesses that were inherent in the city state.
Germanicus and I are going to the theater after we sacrifice to our idea of a philosopher king. That would be Augustus, who built the Roman Empire. And Germanicus and I were jesting before we began about how Rome didn't do soft power. Germanicus, you wanted to mention that there's been a discovery in the 21st century in Vienna, just in capsule form. What did they find?
They found the remains of 150 or so legionnaires in a common grave. And this suggests um, an ambush situation in a battle in the rugged forested terrain up by Vienna, which was a Vindalamium, I think. And it is dated fairly closely to the period of our own time of Domitian or shortly thereafter. And it's interesting that one of the events that occurred is occurring with our emperor is the rebellion of German tribes that had been pacified and were supposed to be vassals of Rome. And then they rose up around this time, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and of course the Sarmatians. And battles were fought up at that crook on the Danube. And there were many battles where the Romans were not victorious. And this is one of the things about Rome was its resilience, because in ancient times, as it has been in modern times, you can't win them all, but you have to be able to bounce back. And that was probably Rome's greatest military capacity, was that.
Germanicus is Marco Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're headed to the theater. Terence, two brothers. One has an adopted son. The other has a natural son. Both their sons fall in love with the wrong girls. They tend to, in Terence plays, they're always slaves who are owned by some slave master who wants something from them. That's the setup. This is the Roman equivalent of a rom-com, a romantic comedy. And in the end, everybody gets married, so we enjoy it. This is the Friends of History Debating Society, a central banker to negotiate between the Russian Empire and the American Empire. Fascinating. I'm John Batchelor.